Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Munn, and I'm with the League of Education Voters. Welcome to our free online webinar series called Lunchtime LEVinars. We started this series close to 4 years ago to share information and build knowledge on important and timely issues. The Legislature made significant changes to the K-12 education funding structures in 2017, infusing more than $7 billion in state money into the system over 4 years through House Bill 2242. As the fiscal impacts of these changes become clearer, legislators proposed a range of adjustments to address concerns that districts have voiced around HB 2242. LEV had created a side-by-side on different bills that were put forward to make fixes to the system. As the legislature has moved forward, of course, there have been changes from the side-by-side. So instead of using that side-by-side, we're going to switch to a supplemental sub-budget side-by-side so you can see what's actually and learn about what's actually moving forward still in the legislature. Today, we will hear from Julia Warth and Jake Vela, both LEV staff. I'm going to give you a brief introduction on both of them. Julia is LEV's Assistant Director of Policy and Government Relations. Julia joined League of Education Voters in 2015. Prior to joining LEV, she worked as a senior research analyst for the Washington State Board of Education, helped launch the Washington State Charter Schools Association, and worked in public policy consulting. Julia is committed to helping create a school system in which every student has access to an education that prepares and empowers. Julia received her bachelor's in literature and government from Claremont McKenna College in Southern California and returned home to Seattle for her master's in education from the University of Washington. When she's not in the office, Julia enjoys playing in the mountains and spending time with her family and her dog, Gus. We also have Jake Vela, who is a senior policy analyst at LEV. Jake Vela's has a strong desire to get involved in the civic process, led him to work in the election cycle in Nevada. That adventure compelled him to work as a legislative assistant in the Nevada legislature, where he focused on civic engagement and electoral issues. The strong civic culture and beautiful scenery of the great Northwest managed to lure him away from Nevada. After settling in Seattle, Jake attended the Evans School of Public Affairs at the University of Washington, and prior to joining the League of Education Voters, Jake worked with local nonprofits in strategic planning and working to develop policies to improve the quality of life of formerly homeless individuals in downtown Seattle. Jake received his BA in Political Science and Spanish from the University of Nevada. He earned his Master's of Public Administration from the Evans School of Public Affairs with a focus on policy analysis and urban policy. When not in the office, he can be found wandering the Cascades, enjoying Seattle's parks, honing his skills as a home brewer, or watching terrible 90s action movies. And Jake is also a new dog owner called Juniper. You probably heard some shuffling and a little bit of murmuring in the background. That's because the policy team, because things are changing so fast in the legislature, they're talking to each other literally right now about what they're learning and what they're going to change in this presentation today. So bear with us a little bit. You're going to get the most current information possible. So take a look at your screen. You'll notice a chat function on the bottom. This is a place for you to pose questions to us. As always, feel free to send any feedback about the webinar quality to us on the chat function or to info@educationvoters.org. With that, I'd like to welcome Julia and Jake.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And thank you everyone for joining us today. As Kelly mentioned, things have been rapidly changing. So what we are going to do today is we're going to discuss the two budgets that have been released in the K-12 provisions of those budgets. So that is Senate Bill 6032 and House Bill 2299. And then the remainder of the webinar will be devoted to the other policy changes that do not currently appear in the Senate budget made in Senate Bill 6362, which is the only policy bill that is currently moving through the legislative process. So as Kelly said, if you have any questions, please include them in the chat function because things might get a little hairy here for a second. All right, the budgets released by the Senate and the House address a number of areas that were also addressed last session in House Bill 2242, so K-12 salaries, staff salaries, regionalization factors, state-funded professional development, staffing ratios, special education funding, and K-3 class size funding. So for K-12 staff salaries, last year increases to staff salaries were put into law, and the timeline for those salary increases was to be half funded in the 2018-19 school year and fully funded in the 2019-20 school year. The State Supreme Court said that in order to comply with their McCleary decision, that the state would need to fully fund those teacher salaries by the 2018-19 school year. The Senate, in their proposed budget, which is again Bill 6032, fully funds those staff salary levels in the 2018-19 school year. The House budget does not make any changes to the implementation timeline, and so maintains that half next school year and full funding in 2019-2020 timeline. In terms of the regionalization factor, last session, the legislature put into law that staff salaries would be enhanced depending on the cost of housing in a school district, and that there would be 3 tiers of enhancement at 6%, 12%, and 18%. What analysis has shown is that there are a number of districts that border on other districts that are getting there are districts that are not getting regionalization or getting a lower amount of regionalization that border districts with regionalization or higher regionalization. And to address some of those concerns, both the Senate and the House in their budgets modify the staff salary regionalization factor to account for that. And basically, if a district borders on another district that receives more than a 6% higher regionalization than that district, then they also get an additional bump of 6%. If you have questions about that, feel free to ask because it's a little convoluted. Basically, if you're neighboring a district that's getting more than you, there is a provision to help address some of that. In addition to that, the House proposed budget also includes a teacher salary enhancement that takes into account the teacher experience and master's degree or education level, and would provide a 4% salary increase to districts that have higher than average teacher experience and education levels. In last legislative session in House Bill 2242, the legislature eliminated staff mix, which was our previous formula factor that took into consideration teacher experience and education. The Senate bill does not put any new provision. The Senate budget does not put any new provision into law around that and keeps the state average salary, whereas the House budget does include this quote-unquote experience factor. In the 2017 session, the state also funded 3 professional development days to be phased in over the next 3 years, with 1 day being funded by the state next year, 2 days being funded in the 2019-2020 school year, and 3 days being funded in the 2021 school year. The Senate budget delays implementation of those state-funded professional development days to begin in the 2019-2020 school year. And the House budget makes no changes to that implementation timeline. In last legislative session, there were some minor adjustments to family engagement coordinators and counselor allocations in the prototypical funding formula. None are being made in the Senate budget this year. The House budget is increasing staffing allocations for elementary school family engagement coordinators and middle school guidance counselors. Both budgets increase the enhancements for special education funding. Our current law says that for each special education student, the enhancement is an additional 93% of the basic education allocation. The Senate budget would move that up to 96.09%. The House budget would move that up to 97.5%. And then finally, in K-3 class size funding, currently the state provides money to reduce K-3 class sizes. For this current school year, there was no requirement that districts actually reduce the class sizes with those funds. Beginning next year in current law and in the proposed Senate budget, that requirement would go into place. So in order to receive your K-3 class size reduction money, you must actually demonstrate those K-3 class size reductions. The House budget would delay that requirement for another year. So you would be able to receive the class size reduction money without demonstrating that actual class size reduction. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jake to discuss some of the other policy changes that have been made in Senate Bill 6362, which passed the Senate and is reflected in the Senate budget and is currently moving through the House.
Yes, thank you, Julia. I'm going to start by covering levies. And in the last couple of months, there's been a lot of proposals to change the levy structures, amounts or caps. In the most recent, both the House and Senate budgets include no changes to the current levy system. So the changes that were made in 2242 last summer would remain unchanged for going forward in the current proposals. And just to refresh people's memories, the current levy cap system is now starting this next year will be districts can raise up to $2,500 per student, or pass a maximum local levy rate of $1.50 per $1,000 assessed value. So districts can raise no more than $2,500 per student. And if they can't raise that much, then they're capped at no more than $1.50 in a local levy tax. There are also no changes made to LEA in the current proposals, both in the House and the Senate. One of the changes that is made in the proposals is in the House version, since they do fully fund teacher salary per state law, starting in 2018-2019, the requirement that local levy dollars cannot be spent to supplement basic education will take effect this upcoming school year to coincide the full funding of teacher salaries. The Senate version remains, current law holds true, where that requirement will not go into effect until teacher salaries are fully funded 2019-2020. They will, the annual inflationary adjustments will be made for both the House and Senate versions. There are no changes to the Senate's to the new requirements on OSPI checking or verifying and approving districts' local levy expenditure plans on how they're going to spend their local enrichment levies. That will start in current law in 2020, in 2020 school year, and that remains unchanged in the House version. In the Senate version, as well as in the House version. Now we get to some of the fun additional changes. There's a lot of small changes that are made. Well, not necessarily small changes, but don't really fall into any broader category. And one of those is they're changing essentially when they send out money to districts. The state fiscal year and the district fiscal year do not line up. The state fiscal year is from July through June, and the district fiscal year is September through August. So what the state's doing is they're delaying when they pay the school districts to move the money that they actually pay districts to the next fiscal year for the state, while still maintaining the same fiscal year for the district. This is an accounting mechanism to still pay a certain amount of money in a given school year, but have it delayed for the next fiscal year for the purposes of state funding. In both the House and the Senate versions, propose a change to the criteria around the high poverty concentration factor for the learning assistance program that was created last session. Right now, in law, if a district has more than 50% of their students eligible for the free and reduced math science program, they're eligible for the concentration factor within the learning assistance program and get an additional funding for their students. Right now, it's based on your previous year's enrollment numbers. Now they're going to be switching to, for both proposals, rolling average of the previous 3 years to see if you qualify based on that metric to try to limit the volatility of that measure. One of the clarifications that was made in the Senate version of the proposal was to clarify how both public charter schools and tribal compact schools will be funded. With the changes in 2242, that became a little ambiguous and wasn't really clear. It was left up to interpretation. So they added some language to clarify that public charter schools and tribal compact schools will be funded in the same way that the schools that are in the district that they're located in will be funded. So there will be a funding parity on that level in both in the Senate version. The House version has not made that clarification in their language yet. Mainly because they have not produced a standalone education policy bill similar to 6362 that came out of the Senate. One major change regarding the Running Start funding formula that's included in the Senate version of 6362 is a change in the way that the Running Start program is funded. Currently, it's per student amount. It's calculated based on how high schools are funded across the state, and that's used as a basis for the Running Start funding formula. So a full-time enrolled Running Start student will get that rate, which is currently about $6,570 for the current school year. But since that's tied to the overall funding for the state, which is tied to teacher salary, that is set to increase significantly in the next coming years as teacher salary is fully funded from the state. So that it's set to increase by 2019, 2020 to around $8,400 per student. In the House version, in the Senate version of 6362, they've changed the Running Start funding formula and put a static number on that, where each student will be funded at a rate of $6,570 per student, adjusted for inflation. So essentially, it holds the funding level constant in today's terms and adjusts it for inflation, so they won't see the added funding that will come with increased teacher salaries. That's a mechanism that essentially hold the rate of increase for the Running Start program constant and just pin it to inflation, rather than allowing the recent overall funding enhancements to also impact Running Start as they would have previously, and as they would in current law if nothing has changed. And that, there's one more change that was made in the Senate version of delaying implementation of the state-funded professional development days by 1 year. So right now in current law, starting next school year, the state will fund 1 day of professional development. for all certificated instructional staff. That'll increase to 2 days for the 2019-2020 school year and reach 3 days in the 2020-2021 school year and beyond. So that implementation is delayed in actually both the House and the Senate versions to just hold off on implementation for 1 additional year.
And just a couple more details on 6362, which is, again, the Senate policy bill that has been moving through the process. The Senate created a salary safety net program for the 2018-19 school year. This would be in addition to the current hold harmless provisions that were put into place by House Bill 2242 last year. This salary safety net would, of course, be subject to funding in the budget. So that remains to be seen. There were also some changes made to the special education program, including the addition of 3 professional development days as part of the special education base allocation. Previously, OSPI had been tasked with revising rules on the special education safety net program by September 1, 2019. That date has been moved up to September 1, 2018. So changes would be made to that program a year earlier. And I think that is the majority of the major changes. If there are questions about other details or things that people have heard about in the bill, we'd be happy to answer those as well. But I think we are ready to take questions.
Thank you, Jake and Julia. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Folks who are listening, please type your questions in the chat feature on the bottom of your screen. No question is too basic. This was pretty in-depth information. So please, 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 you will be representing other listeners if you ask the basic questions. You can also ask hard questions. I'm going to start with Jim Kolakowski. Hi, Jim. This is Kelly. So from Jim, we are hearing that the legislature is considering cutting levy authority even more than what it is currently in 2242, down to the 150 rate. If this happens, our district and many others will have to cut programs and people. We use levy dollars to hire more counselors and teachers that the state doesn't pay for. What is League of Education voters' position on this?
So we were just conferring in the room briefly. We have not heard of any intent to reduce local levy authority, so that would be very concerning if that is what you're hearing. We would not support a reduction in levy authority in this way, particularly if it was not coupled with additional funding to support things like additional teachers and counselors, which you said you are currently funding with levy dollars. So, yeah.
Thank you. In the Senate budget, from your opinion, what do you think is the most impactful to students? What would we want to see the most in the Senate budget? And then I'm going to ask the same thing on the House. I'm stumping the policy analyst. The most impactful to students.
So I think that what will be most impactful would be the increases to special education funding and the rolling averages used for the lab concentration factor, because both would allow additional services to students that might not otherwise get them under our current law. Jake, anything in addition to that?
I think that's a good point to focus on.
Remember, you can continue to ask questions. I've been calling it the chat box. That was our old communication tool. In our new tool, it's called the Q&A box. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen to ask us questions. And here comes one. Who does the guided pathways funding go to under higher ed? There's a couple of questions to that. Do you want me to read them all? Is that FTE based, current program based, other providers in workforce development?
I don't have the details on that funding allotment. That was included in both the House and Senate budgets. In their overall omnibus appropriations bill. So unfortunately with the bill, they just kind of put high level information about funding amounts in fiscal years, and they don't provide the details on how this can be allocated. In a lot of the guided pathways work currently is being done through the 2-year SBCCC system. So I imagine it would go out through the 2-year institutions. But after that, I'm not sure how it will be allocated. Those are the things that will get clarified in the coming weeks. Unfortunately, we don't have that clarification right now.
Thank you, Jake. Will the budget documents be sent electronically to participants to share with their networks? This is from Jim Smith.
Yes.
Jim.
So the side-by-side, which should be on your screen currently, is available on our website, and I believe we can send out a link to it. We can also include in that a link to the legislature's budget website, which has highlight documents available. So you can peruse the budget documents if you really feel like that would be a fun thing to do.
Hi, Nancy. With the widespread failure of school bonds, is there any reconsideration of the K-3 class size compliance? Many growing school districts do not have the physical classrooms to reduce class sizes, so they will lose the class size reduction funds.
That's a very good point. That's a challenge that a lot of districts across the state are facing, especially with the challenge of passing local capital bonds with a supermajority of 60%. It's a problem that is definitely we're looking into, and we think needs to be addressed. Right now, for either the Senate or the House proposals, they haven't really addressed it. They've talked about delaying it. But I think there's definitely a deeper conversation needed around what the needs of districts are and how we can better support that.
There was also a bill, I believe it was in the House State Government Committee, to change the threshold for bond passage from 60% to 55%. That I don't believe is moving any longer.
No, it's no longer moving through the process.
Yeah.
Thank you. Another question from Jim Kolakowski. Districts currently use levy dollars to make up shortfalls in state funding, i.e. special ed. Even with the increase in special ed funding being proposed, some districts will need to use levy dollars to cover shortfalls in state funding. This is also true with transportation costs for some districts, with costs of sick leave, etc. Will districts be punished for using levy dollars for basic ed? And how will we cover these costs if we do not receive enough state funding?
So that is a great question, and I think you've hit upon an anxiety that is being felt across the state in many other districts. This is something that will be determined ultimately by OSPI, who is responsible for approving and monitoring the use of local levy dollars. I believe that they have sent out some guidance on this to districts, particularly around special education, and it will be up to them and the rules that they define on what counts as enrichment, as well as the state auditor's office, which will be auditing, obviously, school districts on a more regular basis. One thing to note in the Senate Bill 6362, the policy bill, there are some changes made to transportation levies, and those are no longer included in the enrichment levy caps. So there is some increase in the authority of districts to raise transportation dollars in the Senate version of the bill right now.
Thank you. We have another question from James Smith. Jim Smith, and we will probably take one or two more questions after this, and then we'll finish out. How is LEV dealing with pushback inquiries being expressed by communities about the impact on property taxes as a result of the legislature trying to address McCleary requirements?
That is a great question. We, as an organization, have not, well, unless Kelly and the field team have not really received any specific calls or emails about the property tax rate yet. I think people are still receiving their property tax bills. We previously have not taken a position on revenue sources, but just that the legislature needs to come up with sustainable revenue sources to fund education. So this is perhaps a larger conversation with our legislature about what sustainable and equitable funding really looks like.
And on that note, we are currently looking into all of the levies that recently passed last week. We're kind of going to go back and compare that to previous performance in those same districts and kind of see how support for local levies has potentially changed in recent years. And of course, we can't trace it back to any changes that were made in the local levy system or state property tax, but we just want to kind of put the information out there so people can kind of better understand the new landscape that we're currently in.
Thank you, Jake and Julia. And with that, we're going to close the Q&A portion of the LEVinar. Our next LEVinar is at 12:30 on Thursday, March 8th. We will be focusing on parent engagement with Erin Okuno, Executive Director of the Southeast Seattle Education Coalition. Thanks to each of you for joining us today. If you have any additional questions or comments, please send them to Kelly, K-E-L-L-Y, @educationvoters.org. A recording of today's presentation will be available on our website. Please feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues. And again, thank you for attending. We hope you will join us in the future.